History knew him as the man who decided life and death with a single gesture. Calm, precise, unshaken. But what if there was a far deeper side to his story that history missed? Before the world called him the Angel of Death, he was simply Josef. No madness, no chaos, only discipline, faith, and ambition. This is not the story of a monster born, but of a man who believed he was right, until right and wrong no longer mattered. This is Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death. Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in the small town of Günzburg, Bavaria, to a well-to-do family. His father, Karl, owned a factory that made farming equipment like plows and harvesters. The family valued order and discipline above all. Josef's mother, Walburga, was strict and made sure everyone followed the rules at home. In their house, everything had to be done perfectly, and mistakes were not tolerated. As a child, Josef was taught that good behavior meant following the rules exactly. His father showed him that success came from doing things the right way and avoiding mistakes. Josef's life was structured around this belief. He had to act with precision, just like the machines his father built. This strict environment shaped how he saw the world. Order and control were the keys to success. The Mengele family was respected in their town, and they had a comfortable life. Young Josef learned that maintaining a good reputation was important. He was expected to be polite, well-behaved, and, most of all, perfect in everything he did. He was not allowed to show weakness or make mistakes. This pressure to be perfect made Josef grow up with a serious attitude, always trying to meet high expectations. Josef's childhood was one of discipline, and his parents made sure he understood the value of hard work and order. His father's factory ran like a well-oiled machine, and at home, everything was neat and controlled. He was taught that success required focus, and he took these lessons to heart. As he grew older, he became more serious about meeting his parents' expectations, and he began to see the world in the same way his father did, as a place to be shaped and controlled. Even as a young boy, Josef showed signs of being serious and detached from his emotions. He wasn't like the other children who played and laughed freely. Instead, he observed, always looking for ways to improve and perfect things. This need for control and order, drilled into him by his parents, would be the foundation of his future life and choices. He believed that being in charge and following rules was the only way to succeed. Germany, when Josef was growing up, was a country still hurting from World War I. The country had lost the war, and the peace treaty left Germany feeling humiliated. People in Josef's town often talked about the shame of losing, and they dreamed of a time when Germany could be great again. His father, Karl, always spoke about the need to restore Germany's power and pride. Josef, as a young boy, listened closely to these talks. At the dinner table, his parents talked about how Germany had been treated unfairly by other countries. They blamed the loss on weakness and believed that Germany could only be saved by becoming strong and united. This idea stuck with Josef. He began to see loyalty to the country as a way to heal the national wounds. To him, patriotism meant not just loving his country, but making it strong again. Germany's defeat in the war and the bad economic times that followed made people angry and frustrated. The country was divided, and many were looking for a way to restore the nation's pride. Josef saw these struggles around him, and they shaped his thinking. He understood that if Germany was going to become great again, it needed to be controlled, just like his father's factory. Strength and order were the answers to the nation's problems. By the time Josef was a teenager, the country's economic struggles and the political chaos made him believe that the only way forward was through strength and discipline. He began to think of the world in terms of power and order. His father's emphasis on control and hard work, combined with the national anger over Germany's defeat, made Josef see discipline as the solution to every problem. His patriotism grew, and he became more focused on how to make Germany strong again. Josef's early life was shaped by this combination of personal and national trauma. He learned to value discipline, control, and strength, all ideas that matched his country's need for renewal. His belief that perfection and order were the answers to problems would guide him throughout his life. At the same time, he began to see the world around him as something that could be fixed by following strict rules and working for a greater purpose, a purpose he thought Germany was also in need of. Josef went on to study philosophy and medicine at the University of Munich. He was a good student, focused on his studies, and determined to learn as much as he could. His main interest was in how the human body worked. He believed that the human body, like any machine, could be understood and perfected through careful study. At university, he excelled in his studies, especially in anatomy and genetics, but it was the idea of improving the human race that really fascinated him. In his classes, Josef learned about theories of evolution and natural selection. These ideas, which were becoming popular in Europe, argued that only the strongest and fittest should survive. He began to think that the human race, just like animals or plants, could be made better if only the right people controlled it. This belief in improvement through control matched what he had learned from his family, and it gave him a sense of purpose. Josef's professors often discussed Darwin's ideas about survival and the role of race in human development. This was the time when racial science was becoming more accepted in German academia. Josef's mind was drawn to these ideas. He began to see people not as individuals, but as parts of a greater system that could be classified, measured, and improved. The idea of perfection, which he had learned at home, now seemed possible in biology. He started thinking about how science could be used to improve people's lives by making them healthier and stronger. But soon, this interest shifted from just improving people's health to controlling their genetic traits. He believed that some people were naturally better than others, and that society could be improved by making sure only the best people survived. This belief in creating a better world through science would shape his future actions and decisions. By the time Josef graduated, he had moved beyond simply studying the human body. He had become obsessed with the idea of shaping society by controlling who could live and who could die. His belief in the power of science and intellect led him to reject the idea of mercy or compassion. Instead, he began to think that the strong should rule, and the weak should be left behind. This idea would continue to grow, eventually leading him to embrace dangerous and extreme ideologies. While others around him found comfort in religion or faith, Josef found his belief in reason and science. To him, logic and understanding were more important than anything else. He believed that if people could just look at the world rationally, everything would make sense. Compassion and feelings were distractions to him, things that clouded true understanding. He thought that only through reason could the world be fixed. This was his new faith. In his eyes, emotion was a weakness that prevented progress. He saw himself as someone who could use his knowledge to make things better. For Josef, the mind was everything. He believed that human beings could be improved and perfected through reason alone, and that emotions like love or mercy only got in the way of true progress. Compassion, he thought, was unnecessary for the scientific improvement of the world. Josef began to see the world as a machine that could be fixed through careful study. Just like a broken piece of machinery, people could be repaired, and the world could be made more efficient if people worked together with logic and reason. He believed that society, just like the human body, had to be controlled and organized to run smoothly. The goal in his mind was to make people better, and he thought that only through science could this be achieved. At university, he surrounded himself with others who shared his views. They too believed that only rational thought could solve the world's problems. Josef's belief in science grew stronger as he read more books and studied different theories. He began to think that society could be shaped just like the human body. and that the right people could improve the world by controlling who was allowed to be a part of it. As his ideas grew stronger, Josef began to reject anything that did not fit into his vision of the world. He became cold and distant from others, thinking of them as either useful or unimportant. Emotions, relationships, and family bonds all seemed less important to him than his new faith in reason. What mattered to him was perfection and order, and he believed that only science could bring them to the world. By 1933, Germany was on the brink of a major political shift. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had taken control of the country, promising to restore order and greatness. For Josef Mengele, this was a natural fit. The ideas of the Nazis aligned perfectly with his own beliefs in strength, purity, and control. The political change seemed to him like the next step in achieving the world of order and precision he had always desired. Josef's personal beliefs, rooted in discipline and the power of science, made him feel like the Nazi Party's rise was inevitable. He had spent years studying how people could be classified and improved through genetics and biology, and now there was a political party promising to put those ideas into practice. The Nazis were talking about creating a strong, united Germany, a perfect fit for Josef's vision of what the world should be. In his mind, the rise of the Nazis was not a moment of fear, but an opportunity. He began to believe that he could play a role in shaping this new Germany, where the strong would rule and the weak would be removed. The idea of racial purity and biological superiority that the Nazis spoke about sounded like the natural extension of his academic work. He saw it not as extremism, but as progress. At the same time, his sense of detachment grew. His belief that logic could solve everything led him to see others as either useful or expendable. He became less connected to his emotions and more obsessed with the idea of perfecting humanity through science. The Nazi Party seemed to offer a path toward achieving this, and Josef began to believe that he was the one who could help make it happen. By the end of 1933, as the Nazi Party solidified its power, Josef Mengele made the decision that would shape his future. He would join the SS and begin to serve the regime. He believed that science and order would lead the way to a perfect world, and he would be part of it. This would mark the beginning of his transformation from a student of medicine to an architect of human destruction. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became the leader of Germany. The country was struggling after the war, and Hitler promised to bring strength and order back. For Josef Mengele, this wasn't just about politics. He saw it as an opportunity to put his ideas into action. Mengele believed that with the right scientific knowledge, Germany could be made stronger and better. He thought that Nazism wasn't just politics, but the way to make a perfect world. Mengele had spent years studying medicine, genetics, and biology. He believed science could be used to improve society. When the Nazis came to power, he saw them as the perfect people to help his beliefs become real. They wanted to build a stronger, purer Germany, and Mengele thought science was the key to making this happen. He was excited by the idea that he could now use his knowledge to help the country. At first, Mengele didn't see the extreme parts of Nazi ideology. He was mainly focused on their belief in racial purity and how science could help make the population healthier and stronger. He agreed with the idea that some races were more important than others. This idea fit perfectly with the way Mengele thought about genetics and the human body. He believed that the world could be improved by controlling who was allowed to live and who wasn't. Mengele began to think that science could be used to create a perfect race. He saw the Nazis as the ones who could help him put these ideas into practice. The idea of improving humanity through science excited him, and he believed it was a way to fix Germany's problems. Mengele was not concerned with the violence and cruelty that came with these ideas. To him, it was just part of the process of building a perfect world. By 1933, Mengele had already made up his mind. Nazism and science could work together to create a better future. He believed that the strong should survive and the weak should be removed. He thought this was the only way to ensure that the world would improve. He saw himself as part of this great plan to perfect humanity, not as a doctor trying to help individuals, but as a soldier in a war for the future of mankind. In 1935, Mengele moved to Frankfurt to work at the Institute for Hereditary Biology. There, he met Ottmar von Verschuer, a professor who was a well-known leader in the field of eugenics. Eugenics is the study of improving the human race by controlling who can have children. Verschuer believed that only certain people should be allowed to have children, based on their race and genetics. Mengele admired him and became his student. Under Verschuer's guidance, Mengele learned how genetics could be used to improve the human race. Verschuer taught him that some races were genetically superior, while others were inferior. This idea fit perfectly with Mengele's own beliefs about order and perfection. Verschuer's ideas strengthened Mengele's views and helped him justify his own thinking about racial purity. Verschuer also taught Mengele that science was the key to controlling society. The scientist was not just a doctor, but a guardian of the future, using science to determine who should live and who should die. Mengele learned that the study of genetics and heredity could be used to guide the nation. To him, science was not just about research. It was about taking control of the future. Under Verschuer, Mengele's ideas became more extreme. He began to see the human race as something that could be controlled and perfected. No longer just a student, Mengele now felt like he was part of a greater plan to fix the world. He believed that his research could help create the perfect human race, and that it was his duty to contribute to the cause. Verschuer's influence on Mengele went beyond just scientific knowledge. He also shaped Mengele's moral beliefs. Mengele no longer saw people as individuals with rights. He saw them as genetic material to be studied, classified, and perfected. This was the point when Mengele fully embraced the idea that science could be used to eliminate flaws in the human race. As Mengele continued his studies, his views on race and genetics became more radical. He began writing papers about hereditary health courts, where people would be judged based on their genetics, and only those with desirable traits would be allowed to have children. He believed that this was the only way to improve society and create a stronger nation. To him, this was a moral duty, not just scientific research. Mengele's work became more focused on racial hygiene, the idea that people should be classified based on their race, and that certain races were better than others. His papers reflected the growing influence of Nazi ideology, which promoted the idea that racial purity was essential for the future of the country. He no longer saw compassion or empathy as important. What mattered was data and science. In his papers, Mengele started to replace morality with science. He believed that the world would be better off if society could be controlled using genetic principles. He argued that people with undesirable traits, such as disabilities or certain racial backgrounds, should be removed to improve society as a whole. To him, this wasn't cruel. It was necessary for progress. His belief in racial purity and eugenics grew stronger every day. He no longer cared about the individual lives he was affecting. He cared about the future of the human race. In his mind, creating a perfect society meant eliminating imperfections, and those imperfections could be scientifically measured. He began to see himself not as a doctor who healed, but as a scientist who perfected humanity. Mengele's shift in belief was complete. He no longer believed in helping individual patients. He believed in improving the human race. He thought that the weak should be eliminated to allow the strong to thrive. His research was no longer about helping people, but about creating a perfect world. This belief in perfection through science would guide everything he did from this point forward. In 1939, Josef Mengele married Irene Schönbein, a woman from a respected family. Their marriage was not based on deep love, but on shared values. Both were from well-educated, disciplined families, and the marriage reflected the ideals of order and perfection that they both believed in. Irene was supportive of Josef's ambition, and their relationship seemed like a perfect match, built on control and order rather than affection. For Mengele, marriage was not about emotion. It was about discipline and structure. He saw his marriage to Irene as another part of his plan to create the perfect life. Together, they were a team, and their life was carefully planned and controlled, much like the world Mengele imagined. Irene played her role as his supportive partner, and in return, Josef saw her as the ideal woman, obedient and cultured. In their marriage, there was little room for emotional attachment. Perfection was their goal, and anything that didn't fit into that vision was pushed aside. Irene was supportive of Josef's career and helped him achieve his ambitions. Josef, in turn, saw their marriage as a partnership for success, rather than a personal relationship. He believed that order and control were more important than emotional connection. As the Nazi Party grew in power, Josef's focus on his career and his scientific ambitions became more intense. He believed that his work could help shape the future of Germany, and he saw his marriage to Irene as an important part of that. Together, they formed a stable, disciplined family that mirrored the order Josef wanted to create in the world. There was no room for emotions like love or affection. What mattered was that everything in his life was in perfect balance. Their marriage was a reflection of Mengele's growing belief that everything in life had a purpose, and that nothing should interfere with achieving that purpose. Love was not a priority for him. Order was. He saw Irene as a partner in his mission to perfect not only his life, but the world around him. His marriage was part of his grand vision of a controlled, orderly world, where everything, including personal relationships, was shaped by discipline and ambition. By 1939, Josef Mengele's transformation from a student to a believer in Nazi ideology was complete. He had embraced the idea that racial purity and order were essential for creating a perfect world. He joined the SS Medical Corps, believing that his knowledge of medicine and genetics would help build a stronger, healthier Germany. For him, the SS was not just a military organization. It was a way to put his scientific beliefs into practice. Mengele saw the SS as an opportunity to serve the state and apply his ideas about racial improvement. He believed that science and discipline could be used to create the perfect world. The Nazi Party provided him with the perfect platform for his ambitions. Mengele joined the SS not just to follow orders, but to shape the future of Germany, using his scientific knowledge to control who lived and who died. The more Mengele became involved with the Nazi Party, the more he believed that racial purity was not just a scientific issue, but a moral duty. He felt that the weak should be removed to ensure that only the strongest people could thrive. The SS gave him the chance to act on these beliefs. Mengele thought that by helping the Nazis, he was doing the right thing, even though it meant sacrificing the lives of others. By the time the war began, Mengele had fully embraced the idea that science was the key to creating a perfect world. He was no longer just a doctor. He saw himself as part of a mission to perfect humanity through control and discipline. He joined the SS because he believed that this was his duty, a duty to use his knowledge to make the world better, no matter the cost. Mengele's beliefs had led him to a dangerous place. He no longer questioned the morality of his actions. He believed that perfection was the only thing that mattered. He had been seduced by the idea that science and order could create the world he had always dreamed of. By the time the war began, Mengele was ready to do anything to make that dream a reality, including carrying out the horrible experiments that would define his life. In 1939, World War II began, and Josef Mengele's career as a doctor took him to the front lines. He served as a battalion physician, stationed with the German army on the Eastern Front. The war brought constant violence, and Mengele saw firsthand the brutal effects of battle. Wounded soldiers were brought to him, their injuries severe and overwhelming. But Mengele focused not on their pain, but on the scientific details of the injuries. To him, the human body was an object to be studied, not someone to be cared for. As soldiers screamed in agony, Mengele observed their suffering with a detached interest. He noted down everything, from their wounds to their reactions. as if it were a laboratory experiment. He had little concern for the soldiers themselves. Instead, he viewed them as data points for his research. The violence of the war did not disturb him. It only gave him more opportunities to study human limits. For Josef, this wasn't about healing, it was about understanding the human body's breaking point. Mengele's focus on scientific observation grew stronger with each day of the war. He was not moved by the suffering around him. The wounded soldiers were treated like any other subject in his studies. He would carefully write down his observations and then move on to the next injury, the next victim. His notes grew longer, his interest in human suffering colder. The compassion that might have once existed in him was slowly disappearing. It was being replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. The battlefield was a place where life and death were measured. To Mengele, there was no emotional weight in the decisions he made. A soldier who survived was treated as a success. A soldier who died was simply another result of the war. His medical work had little to do with healing. It was about collecting data. In this world of war, where the rules of survival seemed arbitrary, Mengele's belief in order and control became even stronger. He was becoming more and more disconnected from humanity. Mengele's work on the front lines marked the beginning of his transformation. The war gave him a chance to distance himself from emotions and focus on his work. He no longer saw the soldiers as people, but as subjects to be studied. This shift in thinking would follow him through the rest of his career. The more war he saw, the more he believed in the logic of control, and the less he cared about human suffering. The humanity he once had was slowly draining away. As the war continued, Josef Mengele saw the military as the perfect environment for his work. The war was like a giant laboratory, where the brutality of battle allowed him to observe how humans reacted to extreme stress. He saw war as a testing ground for his theories. Soldiers were constantly wounded and killed, and Mengele took note of every injury. He was fascinated by the way the human body responded to violence. Death was no longer personal. It was just part of the system. The war allowed Mengele to see how the logistics of destruction could be carried out on a massive scale. He was amazed at how efficiently the Nazis were able to destroy and rebuild. Soldiers were patched up and sent back to fight again, as if they were machines. Mengele began to see death as part of the cycle of war, an inevitable result that could be measured and controlled. He no longer thought of it as tragic, but as necessary for the larger purpose of war. In this laboratory of destruction, Mengele began to rethink his views on human life. He was no longer concerned with healing the injured. Instead, he focused on measuring the human body's limits. He became more and more interested in how people's bodies reacted to injuries and death. To him, death became just another part of the experiment, something to be studied and understood. There was no emotional reaction to it. It was just another data point. The soldiers who were sent to him were not treated as individuals. They were data to Mengele. Whether they survived or died did not matter to him. What mattered was how they responded to the pain, to the injuries, to the violence. Mengele began to see the battlefield as a place where the rules of life and death were written by science, not emotion. It was here, in the heart of the war, that his detachment from humanity deepened. Mengele's view of life and death became more mechanical with each passing day. The human body, in his mind, was no longer something to be saved or cared for. It was a machine that could be studied, broken, and fixed again. The human spirit no longer had a place in his thinking. He had lost any empathy for the soldiers he treated. All that mattered was the experiment and the perfect cold logic of science. Mengele's time in the war helped him rationalize the idea of death in a way that few others could. He started to believe that certain people's lives were less valuable than others. He wrote reports about the biological strain of different populations, especially the Slavic people. In his mind, some races were naturally weaker than others, and their lives were not as important. He thought he was diagnosing a species, not caring for individuals. In his reports, Mengele began to refer to people as genetic material. To him, the value of a person was based on their genetic makeup, their race, their strength, and their potential to contribute to society. He stopped seeing people as individuals and started seeing them as part of a larger biological system. This shift in thinking allowed him to justify what he was doing. The deaths of certain people no longer seemed wrong. They were simply part of the natural order. Mengele believed that science could justify anything. He thought that the best way to improve humanity was to eliminate the weak and keep only the strong. This idea became the foundation of his work. He no longer saw himself as a doctor trying to heal people. He saw himself as a scientist trying to improve the world through genetics. To him, mercy and compassion were unnecessary. What mattered was perfection. By the time he wrote his reports, Mengele had completely removed morality from his thinking. The people he treated were no longer human beings. They were simply data. He saw himself as an agent of science, working for the greater good. The moral implications of his actions were ignored. He had justified his actions by turning them into scientific experiments. Killing or hurting people was not wrong to him. It was just another step in the process of creating a perfect world. As his thinking became more extreme, Mengele started to believe that death was part of the solution. He no longer saw death as tragic, but as necessary for the world to improve. He wrote about his research in cold, clinical terms, with no empathy for the people he was hurting. In his mind, it wasn't murder, it was progress. He had become fully detached from the idea of life and death as human concerns. It was now all about science. In 1942, Mengele was transferred to the Race and Resettlement Office, where he was recommended for a new position at a concentration camp. The SS saw him as the perfect candidate, intelligent, loyal, and unemotional. He was everything the Nazis wanted in a doctor. Mengele, however, didn't see it as just a job. To him, it was recognition. The scientist elevated to engineer, shaping the future of humanity. Mengele's transfer to the SS marked a turning point in his career. He was no longer just a doctor treating soldiers on the front lines. Now, he was part of a larger system, a system that used science to control life and death. He was excited by the opportunity to be part of this biological war, where science and politics merged into one. He thought he could contribute to the Nazi goals of creating the perfect race. His position in the SS meant that he would have access to new resources and opportunities. He would be able to conduct his experiments on a larger scale, with more control over who lived and who died. This was what he had been preparing for, the chance to use his knowledge to make the world perfect. He no longer needed to work within the confines of the medical field. He was now part of a larger plan. Mengele's belief in order and control made him an ideal candidate for the SS. He saw the concentration camps as places where science could be put into practice on a grand scale. His work with the SS would allow him to shape the future, to create the world he had always dreamed of. To him, the camps were not sites of suffering, but places where science could thrive. As Mengele prepared for his new role, he was excited by the possibilities. The SS provided him with the perfect environment to apply his ideas. He felt that he was not just a doctor, but a leader in the fight for genetic perfection. The shift from treating soldiers on the front lines to working for the Nazis felt like a natural progression for him. This was his moment to make his mark on the world. In 1943, Josef Mengele was assigned to Auschwitz, one of the largest Nazi concentration camps. Every day, trains filled with people from across Europe arrived at the camp. Mengele stood on the ramp, where he quickly decided who would live and who would die. The people were not treated as individuals, but as numbers. He made these decisions in seconds, choosing who was healthy enough to work and who would be sent straight to the gas chambers. Mengele's role at the ramp became part of his daily routine. He would glance at the people, judge them based on their health, and send some to work and others to death. He did this without emotion, seeing the people as part of a system. To him, the decision wasn't personal. It was about maintaining order. His hand became an instrument of life and death, moving the flow of prisoners like pieces on a chessboard. The ramp was a place of cold efficiency for Mengele. He didn't pause to consider the lives he was deciding over. He saw no faces, only the goal of maintaining the perfect system. For Mengele, there was no room for compassion, only calculation. The people who were chosen for work were sent away, and those who were not were sent to their deaths. This was the way Mengele saw the world. Everyone had a role to play, and if they didn't fit, they were discarded. Mengele's decisions were quick and final. He didn't stop to reflect or feel guilt. He believed his choices were part of a larger purpose. In his mind, he was helping to build a stronger society, one that was organized and controlled. The pain, fear, and suffering of those he sent to die did not affect him. To him, they were just part of the system that needed to be maintained for a better future. His indifference to the human suffering around him showed how much he had detached from any sense of mercy. The lives of the people were reduced to data points, to be used for a greater cause. Mengele didn't need to feel the weight of his actions. He saw himself as someone who was just doing his job, carrying out the orders of a system that he believed would lead to a better world. At Auschwitz, Mengele began to focus on twins. He believed that studying twins would help him understand genetics better. He started to bring them to his laboratory in Block 10, where he would conduct experiments. These experiments were brutal and painful. Mengele would inject twins with chemicals, perform blood transfusions, and even dismember them to study how their bodies reacted. He recorded every detail of his experiments. Mengele saw these twins as tools for his research. He didn't see them as human beings. They were just samples for his experiments. Their pain didn't matter to him. His main goal was to understand how genetics worked. He believed that if he could prove his theories, he could make the world a better place. The suffering of the twins was just part of the process to him. He believed that genetic purity could create a better world. To Mengele, the deaths and injuries caused by his experiments were not accidents. They were necessary sacrifices for science. He thought that by studying twins, he could uncover the secrets of human heredity and help build a better, stronger society. He was willing to cause pain and suffering to prove his beliefs. Mengele was not concerned with the lives he destroyed. The twins he experimented on were simply part of his scientific mission. He used them for his research, knowing that the results would support his ideas about racial purity and genetics. The emotional pain caused by his experiments didn't matter to him. He believed his work was for the greater good, and that made it worth it. His experiments on the twins were not about helping anyone. They were about proving his theories. Mengele believed that his work would lead to the creation of a stronger, purer world. The suffering of the people didn't matter. He saw himself as a scientist on a mission, with no place for empathy or morality in his work. His vision of perfection was more important than any individual life. Mengele's experiments on the eyes of prisoners were some of the most disturbing. He was especially interested in understanding the condition of heterochromia, where a person's two eyes are different colors. To study this, Mengele used chemicals and hormones on prisoners' eyes, including possibly administering adrenaline drops to alter pigmentation. He worked closely with Karin Magnuson, a biologist, who was also studying eye color changes. They tested whether certain drugs could change the color of rabbits' eyes, and Mengele used this research to experiment on human subjects. Mengele sent eyes removed from Auschwitz prisoners to Magnuson's lab in Berlin for further analysis. The research focused on the anatomy of the eye and how genes might affect eye color. Some of these eyes were collected from people who had died naturally, but others came from those who had been killed. According to an inmate pathologist, Niesli, some eyes came from those who had been killed by lethal injection. Mengele's interest in the eyes was not about cosmetic changes, but about using them as a part of his broader eugenics research. After the war, Magnuson claimed that she believed the eyes sent to her lab came from people who had died of natural causes, but there was no way to be sure. The horror of these experiments was not just in Mengele's methods. but in how he treated human lives as objects for scientific testing. The human cost of these experiments was immeasurable, but Mengele and Magnuson were focused only on scientific advancement. The eyes of the victims were used as evidence for their genetic theories, with no thought to the lives that had been destroyed in the process. The use of prisoners in these experiments shows how Mengele's beliefs had become completely detached from human empathy. The prisoners were not seen as people, but as tools for scientific research. His belief in the greater good of science led him to justify these brutal actions without hesitation. Mengele's eye experiments, along with his other cruel medical studies, represent the extreme lengths he was willing to go to, all in the name of scientific progress. These experiments on the eyes were just another chapter in the larger story of inhumanity that defined his work at Auschwitz. Despite the horrors of his actions, those who met Mengele often described him as polite and even charming. He was well-spoken, handsome, and often hummed while working. To those around him, he seemed like a kind doctor. His calm and pleasant demeanor made his actions seem almost normal, but the politeness only made the terror he caused even worse. How could someone so polite be responsible for such cruelty? Mengele's politeness was a way for him to hide his true nature. He could act charming and make people feel comfortable, even as he led them to their deaths. His politeness was a mask, a way to appear civil while he committed horrific acts. It made him even more terrifying because it showed that evil could be disguised by a polite, pleasant personality. His victims never saw it coming. The politeness worked in his favor. It made the victims feel disarmed and more trusting. They didn't expect the horror that Mengele was capable of. They didn't see him as a killer because he was always well-mannered and calm. But his politeness was a tool of manipulation. It made it easier for him to carry out his experiments without resistance. The kindness he showed only made the terror more confusing. Mengele's behavior was a deliberate contrast to the brutality of his actions. While he harmed and destroyed the lives of countless people, he did it with calmness and control. He never raised his voice or showed anger. His polite manner made it easier for him to do his work without being questioned. His calmness made it harder for others to see the monster beneath the surface. In Auschwitz, Mengele's politeness was a mask that covered his cruelty. He could smile, talk kindly to people, and even hum a tune while conducting horrific experiments. The contrast between his charming exterior and the pain he caused only made his actions more chilling. The victims trusted him because of his politeness, never suspecting that the kind doctor was actually the executioner. Mengele's experiments were always meticulously documented. He kept detailed notes, drawings, and sketches of every experiment. Each dissection, each injection, each death was recorded in his files. To him, these notes were a part of his scientific work, nothing more. They were cold, precise, and impersonal. His scientific archive became a record of his cruelty, a way to keep track of his findings. The details in Mengele's notes were chilling. He carefully cataloged each experiment and the results, without any sense of guilt. Every organ removed, every body part cut off, was just another part of the data. The files were organized like any scientific research paper. Mengele didn't see what he was doing as evil. He saw it as important work that would benefit the future. His notes were the proof that he was achieving something significant. The bureaucracy of genocide was evident in Mengele's work. He treated each life like a case study, writing down everything he observed, as if he were recording a scientific experiment. The camp became a laboratory for his twisted ideas, and the people were his subjects. Mengele saw the system of death and suffering as organized progress, a way to achieve a better world through science. The paperwork Mengele created was both organized and cold. Each death was documented with the same precision that a scientist might use to record the results of an experiment. Mengele didn't feel the horror of what he was doing because it was all part of a system. To him, it was just another day of scientific discovery, not a day of human suffering. His notes were evidence of his belief that science could control life and death. The files Mengele kept became a trophy of his work. They were a record of everything he had done, each document serving as proof of his scientific success. The organized nature of his notes made the death and suffering seem almost normal. Mengele saw the suffering as necessary, a part of the greater scientific mission. His archive of atrocity was a testament to his twisted belief that he was making the world better. In 1945, as the war began to turn against Germany, Soviet forces approached Auschwitz. Mengele knew the camp would soon be liberated, and he decided to flee. He took his notes and his research with him, leaving behind the camp and all the destruction. Auschwitz burned behind him, but his beliefs stayed strong. He didn't see himself as a criminal. Instead, he felt like he had served history, and he thought the world would one day recognize his work. Mengele left Auschwitz unpunished. He was confident that his research would make a difference in the future. He believed he had done nothing wrong because he saw his actions as part of a larger scientific goal. To him, suffering was a necessary part of the process. He didn't feel guilty for what he had done because he thought that in the end, his work would lead to a better world. After leaving Auschwitz, Mengele fled to South America, but he never abandoned his beliefs. He continued to think that his research had been important and justified. He believed that science could be used to create a perfect world, and that his work was part of this goal. Even as the world moved on from the horrors of the war, Mengele held on to his belief in racial purity and genetic improvement. Mengele's departure from Auschwitz didn't mark the end of his beliefs. He continued to think that his work had been necessary for the future of humanity. His escape was not out of fear, but out of the conviction that he had been part of something important. He left the camp with his head held high, believing he had served a greater purpose. Mengele left Auschwitz unpunished, carrying his twisted beliefs with him. His scientific mission had not been completed, and he thought the world would one day recognize his contribution to the future. He was certain that his work was important and would one day be honored. But the true cost of his actions remained hidden, and he would live the rest of his life in denial of the evil he had done. After the war ended in 1945, Josef Mengele was briefly captured by Allied forces. However, he managed to escape their grasp by using a false identity. He disguised himself as a regular soldier and took on a fake name. His SS tattoo, a clear sign of his Nazi ties, was covered, allowing him to pass the inspection. Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, walked free from the hands of justice and blended into the crowd of the post-war exodus. Mengele was now a fugitive, but he had no intention of surrendering to the law. He believed that his work had been justified and that he had been doing important scientific research. He never considered the horror of his actions or the lives he had destroyed. Instead, he focused on escaping justice, using his intelligence and knowledge to hide in plain sight. To him, the world had misunderstood his work. For several years, Mengele managed to avoid detection, living under his false identity. He traveled through Europe, moving quickly and quietly. His calm demeanor and careful planning allowed him to evade authorities. He lived in constant fear of being caught, but he still believed that his work was meaningful. The idea of being hunted did not scare him as much as the thought of facing justice. In his new life, Mengele continued to live as if he were just another man trying to survive. He lived a life filled with secrecy, always changing his name and moving from place to place. Despite the fact that his crimes were known, Mengele continued to tell himself that he had been a misunderstood scientist, doing research for the future of humanity. His guilt was non-existent. His escape was a victory. Mengele's escape was not just about avoiding capture. It was also about maintaining the illusion that he had done nothing wrong. He was determined to keep running and to stay free, as if his crimes were not crimes at all. As long as he remained hidden, Mengele believed that the world would never understand the greatness of his work. His ability to escape made him feel even more untouchable and self-righteous. In the years following his escape, Mengele was helped by a network of Catholic sympathizers and former Nazi officials. These people, known as the rat lines, helped many Nazis escape to countries like Argentina, where they could hide from justice. Mengele made his way to Argentina, where he found refuge among other fascist sympathizers. He was able to blend into a community that shared his views and supported his beliefs. The rat lines provided Mengele with a new life in South America, and he lived without fear of capture for a time. His ability to use his knowledge and connections helped him remain hidden. Mengele didn't just escape physically, he also convinced himself that he was right in his actions. He saw the people helping him as allies, and he felt that he had a purpose that the world had failed to understand. In Argentina, Mengele continued to live under false names, and he even started a new business. He spent his time meeting people, attending social gatherings, and appearing like any other businessman. Despite living in hiding, Mengele was not sorry for his past. He kept journals where he continued to justify his actions. He wrote about how the world had misunderstood his scientific mission. Mengele's life in Argentina was one of secrecy and delusion. He believed that the war and his actions had been misinterpreted. His journal entries were full of thoughts that showed he still viewed himself as a victim, someone who had been misunderstood by the world. His escape allowed him to rewrite his own story, one where he was the hero, not the criminal. Though Mengele lived in comfort, he remained haunted by his past. His fear of being discovered never left him, and he constantly lived in the shadows. However, he found comfort in knowing that he was still free to live his life and continue with his delusions. He refused to accept the idea that he was a criminal. Instead, he believed he was redeemed, continuing his life in hiding without remorse or apology. After settling in Argentina, Mengele began a new life under various aliases. He started a business in Buenos Aires and tried to live as normally as possible. He frequently visited social salons, meeting new people, and participating in the social scene. Even though he lived in hiding, Mengele felt secure in his new life. He believed that the world had forgotten his past. During these years, Mengele kept journals, documenting his thoughts and experiences. He continued to justify his actions in Auschwitz, convinced that his experiments had been part of a greater scientific purpose. He saw himself as a misunderstood genius who had been wronged by the world. His writings showed a man unrepentant, unable to accept responsibility for the pain he had caused. Mengele's life was one of constant change. He lived under several names and rarely stayed in one place for too long. He knew that he had to stay in the shadows to avoid capture. But this didn't stop him from feeling like he had won. In his mind, his escape was a victory over the world that had turned against him. He had evaded justice and continued to live as if nothing had happened. Though Mengele lived in fear of being caught, he didn't allow himself to be consumed by it. He lived in a state of denial, pretending that he was just another person, free from his past. He refused to accept that he had done anything wrong, continuing to live his life with a sense of entitlement. His guilt was buried under layers of self-deception. Mengele's journals also reflect a man still obsessed with order and control. He believed that science was the answer to everything. He thought that the world had failed to see the benefits of his work. Mengele's life in the shadows was not just a fleeting existence. It was one where he tried to hold on to his sense of purpose and conviction. In his mind, he was still part of a grand mission. In 1960, Israel's Mossad agents captured Adolf Eichmann, another high-ranking Nazi. But they missed Mengele by just a few days. This close call scared Mengele, but it also made him even more arrogant. He believed he was untouchable, convinced that his perfect escape plan would never fail. His fear of being caught grew, but so did his sense of superiority. After the Mossad missed him, Mengele became more cautious. He moved between countries, going from Argentina to Paraguay and then to Brazil. He stayed in hiding, always alert to the possibility of being discovered, but still refusing to admit that he was guilty. His fear was mixed with a strange sense of confidence. He believed that justice could never reach him, no matter how hard the world tried. Mengele's life was one of constant movement. He relocated to avoid capture, but his belief in his own importance made him feel like he was always one step ahead. The more he fled, the more he convinced himself that he was invincible. The world, he believed, had failed to recognize the importance of his work, and that was why he was being hunted. His arrogance grew with each passing year. Even as he feared capture, Mengele's sense of self-righteousness grew. He couldn't accept that the world wanted to punish him for his actions. He thought he had been part of a scientific revolution, and the fact that he was still running proved to him that he had been right all along. Justice, to him, was just a misunderstanding. Despite the constant fear of being found, Mengele continued to live under the delusion that he was still a great man. He believed that the world would eventually recognize his scientific contributions. His self-perception as a victim of history kept him from facing the reality of his actions. He was determined to remain free, convinced that he was justified in everything he had done. In 1979, while living in Brazil, Mengele's life came to an unexpected end. He was swimming at a beach when he suffered a stroke and drowned. There was no dramatic arrest, no trial, no moment of reckoning for his crimes. He died by chance, with no victims watching, no justice being served. Mengele, the man who had decided the fate of so many, died alone. Mengele's death was ironic. He had spent his life fleeing from justice, running from the world that had finally moved on from him. He thought he had escaped, but in the end, it was something as simple as a stroke that took his life. The man who had caused so much suffering died without facing the consequences of his actions. No one celebrated his death, no victims took pleasure in it. Mengele had escaped the world, but he couldn't escape the natural world. His death was unremarkable, a quiet end to a man who had lived a life of great evil. He died, thinking that his work would be remembered as important, but he was buried under a false name, his crimes never facing true justice. Mengele had lived his life in denial, believing that his actions were justified. When he died, he still thought he had been part of something important. The world moved on without him, and he was buried like anyone else. There was no trial, no judgment, just the quiet end of a man who had escaped responsibility for decades. In the end, Mengele's death was as unremarkable as his life had been for so many years. His legacy, though, was not erased. The suffering he caused would never be forgotten. The man who had once played God died by chance, with no justice for the millions he had hurt. His death was a quiet reminder that evil can survive the law, but never truly escape the weight of history. In 1985, nearly 40 years after Josef Mengele's escape, investigators discovered bones near São Paulo, Brazil. Forensic experts worked to identify them, and their analysis confirmed what the world had feared. The bones belonged to Josef Mengele, the infamous Nazi doctor. The world was forced to face a painful truth. For 34 years, one of the most dangerous criminals in history had lived freely. He had escaped justice and died without facing the consequences of his actions. The discovery shocked the world, but it also sparked a deep moral inquiry. How could a man responsible for so much suffering and death have lived in peace for so long? The truth was uncomfortable, a reminder that some evils can evade punishment. Mengele's escape wasn't just a failure of the legal system. It was a failure of humanity to confront the evil that had. For many, the news felt like a final blow, an admission that some criminals are never caught, never punished. But the truth was also a call to action. The world could not forget Mengele's crimes. They had to be remembered. His discovery brought a moral reckoning, one that demanded answers about how such cruelty could happen and whether we, as a society, could ever truly prevent it. The bones of Josef Mengele were proof that evil doesn't always meet justice. His death, while fitting for a man who had escaped punishment for so long, didn't bring closure. It left the world with more questions than answers. The truth of his life and death raised uneasy reflections about how evil can persist even in the face of knowledge and justice. When researchers began to study Mengele's journals and diaries, they were struck by their clinical tone and lack of remorse. Mengele had kept careful records of his experiments, his thoughts on genetics, and his justification for the suffering he caused. In his writings, Mengele defended eugenics, the belief that science could determine which humans were worthy of life and which were not. He argued that eugenics was the medicine of civilization, a way to improve humanity by eliminating its weakest members. Mengele's writings showed zero remorse for his actions. He didn't see his cruel experiments as wrong, but as necessary steps in the progress of science. His mind was a closed system, one where logic and science could justify any action. He believed that his work, however painful, would lead to a better world, even if that meant causing immense suffering. His lack of empathy and his ability to rationalize his actions made him seem even more detached from reality. What the researchers found in Mengele's diaries was a man completely convinced of his rightness. He never questioned the morality of his actions. For Mengele, the ends always justified the means. His belief in the greater good of his work made him incapable of seeing the evil he had committed. This lack of self-awareness is what made him such a dangerous figure. He didn't believe he had done anything wrong because his science was supposed to be a force for good. Historians and psychologists have spent years studying how education and ideology can influence a person to the point where they lose their moral compass. Mengele was a perfect example of this. He was highly educated and believed that science could explain everything. But over time, his scientific beliefs became twisted by the ideology of the Nazi regime, which saw certain people as less valuable based on their race or genetics. Mengele's education, combined with the rise of Nazi ideology, helped erase his conscience. He was trained to be a doctor, a scientist, but he was also taught that some people were worth less than others. The ideology of the Nazis was a tool for him to rationalize his cruelty. He didn't see the pain of others as important. He saw it as a necessary part of his research. His education gave him the tools to justify his actions, and the ideology gave him the permission to act on them. After the war, many Nazi scientists, including some of Mengele's mentors, were allowed to reintegrate into society. Some even returned to teaching at universities. Ottmar von Verschuer, one of Mengele's mentors, resumed his academic career. These men had been responsible for dangerous ideologies, yet they were allowed to continue their work as if nothing had happened. This shows how post-war academia quietly welcomed many former Nazis back into its fold. While many Nazi doctors and scientists were officially banned from working in academia, some were able to continue their research in secret. They blended in with society, hiding their past actions. Mengele's work, though often hidden, still had an influence on the field of eugenics and genetics. His research was part of a larger body of pseudo-scientific ideas that continued to linger in medical history. The post-war reintegration of Nazi scientists raises uncomfortable questions about the role of science in war and genocide. Many of these men, including Verschuer, continued to spread their dangerous ideas under the guise of academic research. They used their expertise to continue studying race and genetics, but their work was tainted by the very beliefs that had fueled the horrors of the Holocaust. Mengele's influence didn't disappear after the war. Though his direct involvement with Nazi policies ended, his ideas about genetics and race lived on. These ideas were passed on to new generations of scientists, sometimes without their knowledge of the horrors that had shaped them. Mengele's legacy was not just his actions, but the ideology that he helped spread, an ideology that remains a stain on scientific history. The final questions about Mengele's life remain unanswered. How could a man who studied beauty and the human form become the author of horror? How did curiosity about genetics turn into cruelty? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many people like Mengele believed they were saving the world while committing unspeakable acts? Mengele's story is not just a story about a man. It is a story about humanity's struggle with the dark side of knowledge. It is a reminder that good intentions can become twisted, and that sometimes even the most educated minds can be corrupted by belief. The questions will remain unanswered, but they must never be ignored.